Well, first of all, I'd just like to thank you for all the panelists tonight for the presentations that you've made. They're very informative, and I think food for thought. And everybody, I think, would agree that we just need to know the facts of our history. They're very important. But what I would like to ask, because I was at the Presbyterian, the event in the Barry Street Presbyterian church as well, and it was also an excellent night. But missing from that, and also missing so far, what about the British government's intentions at the time? Because I would be keen to hear what you have to say in relation to why they were behind, or what their view of the build-up to partition, the way in which the northern state emerged, just precisely what the British government had to say and do at the time. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I'll take a break and I think I'll invite Dara maybe to respond.
You can answer that one.
Well, I suppose the British government at the time of partition was Lloyd George's government, and for very good reason. He was nicknamed the Welsh Wizard. He could manage to say the same thing to two people and imply totally different meanings. It's already been mentioned about how he was able to tell Carson one thing and tell Collins the same thing, but with a totally different slant. And yet, I think that Westminster's wish at the time was to pacify the thing, get over the hump, get people into some form of home rule, and they achieved that not once but twice in both Belfast and Dublin. And really after that, while Carson was the one who masterminded the exclusion of Northern Ireland, it was the creation of Craigavon after that. And if you look at those early years of Northern Ireland, there was a very deft manoeuvring going on all the time with Craigavon. First of all, like when it came to Article 12, which, by the way, in terms of how Southern nationalists reacted to the whole question of Ulster's exclusion, or the exclusion of part of Ulster, in the treaty debates in the Dáil in 1922, the alternative proposal, the alternative treaty put forward by Eamon de Valera contained verbatim Article 12 of the thing, which was on the exclusion of Northern Ireland and the Boundary Commission. So there was so de Valera never believed that what the South faced was total exclusion of the North. He thought, like many others, and I think like the British government, that it would eventually sort itself out. I think that they went for pacification, and Craigavon took it from there.
Tom, would you like to come in there?
Well, I think in some senses more interesting is to see what I call the British ruling elite and their intervention in Ireland in this period. And it begins with Lord Randolph Churchill in 1886, and you see his he comes to speak in the Ulster Hall. You see it in the activities of Balfour, and I think what they're about is not just in a sense defending unionists, but also of building the Conservative Party. And then, of course, you see it in the Curragh Mutiny, where very important elements of the British Army in Ireland mutiny at the Curragh. Henry Wilson was one of them. And they say, look, we're not going to intervene in the North. And I think this becomes what I call the psychological prop of the British ruling elite in terms of unionism. And you see it right through. And indeed, when you read the record, it's quite clear that Lloyd George has a great capacity for speaking out of both sides of his mouth. So he promises the unionist one thing, and he promises the nationalist another. And to some extent, when you look at this period, the question has to be asked, to what extent does that elite, ruling elite, shepherd both unionist and nationalist into partition in a way to keep a wedge and an influence in Ireland, their political influence in Ireland, and it's through partition. So while the Liberal government obviously from 1886 had supported Home Rule I do think, as I said, the upper classes in Britain were very much in support of the Unionists, were very much in building a support for a Conservative Party, and really it all ends up in the mess of partition.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the Unionists were very lucky in the way the political cards fell by 1920, 1922. If you think of that shift in the balance of power, the Liberal Nationalist Alliance of 1912-14, overtaken by the war, a coalition government, the Liberal Party in decline, Lloyd George, a Liberal, leading a mainly Tory government, favourable to Ulster's claims. And that government trying to assuage the concerns, fears, aspirations of the Ulster Unionists. There's also a shift, of course, in the sort of Tory view of the Irish question. I mean, in 1914, the Conservatives under Bonar Law, virtually an Ulsterman, used the complete grammar of anarchy, to use that phrase, against the Liberal government. You know, they throw everything at them except the kitchen sink. Churchill is physically blooded in the House of Commons by a Unionist MP from North Antrim who throws a heavy metal book on his bald head. Yet, fast forward 6 years, the Tories are now in the driving seat using Lloyd George, but really they're dominant on the Irish question. They have a stranglehold over it, and yet they make it clear to Craig and Carson that they regard the claims of Ulster in a spirit of resignation rather than enthusiasm. Millions of men have died on the Western Front. Threatening violence to oppose Home Rule isn't as favourable to Conservative ears in 1920. The British government's policy, right through that whole period, the strategic policy of the British government, whether Liberal or Lloyd George coalition, was to keep Ireland as a unit within the British Empire. Their preferred option in the 1920 Act, and indeed during the treaty negotiations as led by Lloyd George, would have been a united Ireland. They would like to have delivered a united Ireland within the empire. It would be favourable to American opinion. It was tidier. It was something that they could sort of deal with more easily. But Lloyd George said Irishmen couldn't agree. But the whole thinking behind the Long Committee, which drew up the Constitution, they used to call it here, the 1920 Act, was that the two parts of Ireland, under their separate parliaments, would eventually meld together by consent. That was the thinking behind it. No one anticipated partition being permanent. Even James Craig, in 1938, in his last years of life, as he looked out the windows of Stormont Castle, was recorded by his Controller General, G.C. Dugan, a Southern Unionist, who was a senior civil servant. And Craig was reflecting on the past, old Craigavon. And he looked out at Carson's statue and he said to him, you know, this border can't last forever. There will be a united Ireland someday. So that was the kind of thinking of unionism. And of course, as late as 1965, in that famous Belfast Telegraph poll, 3 years before the Troubles, 70% of people who read the Belfast Telegraph said they expected a united Ireland in 15 years. That was 1965. So, you know, British policy was about crown and empire. A united Ireland was favoured if you could bring it about. And remember, in 1960, the famous television historian A.G.P. Taylor, who eventually called for troops out of Northern Ireland, but he wrote in 1960 in his survey of British history, he said in 1921, Lloyd George conjured the Irish question out of existence. Nobody had ever heard of it since. And it all came on stream again a couple of years later.